The interpreter.
No, he's already answered twice.
Josiah. He's hiding.
I know. The tallest man in the room is sitting like this.
He's sleeping.
Right. Realistically, no.
Avuze ko bitashoboka mu buryo bugaragara.
This command is impossible, but not one that we do not try to fulfill.
Nyine ibyo Imana dusaba uko dukunda abagore ngo Kristo yakunze itorero ntabwo twabishobora mu mbaraga zacu.
It's similar to what we discussed this morning. We don't look at passages that say be holy for God is holy and say, I can't reach God's level of holiness so I don't have to try.
Ntabwo rero nkuko twabivuze mu gitondo twiga ko Imana itubwira ngo were nkuko yera, ntabwo ibyo bintu wabirira ngo uvuge ngo ntabwo nabishobora ngo uhiturekeraho.
Right? It can still be our goal.
Bikwiye kuba intego yacu.
And so we're going to look at that aspect. Before we get there, we need to understand that we need to realize that men have been called by God to be the leader.
Turaza kureba rero ko abagabo bahamagawe n'Imana kuba abayobozi cyangwa abatware.
So we have to understand what it means to be a biblical leader.
Tugomba kumva icyo bivuze kuba umuyobozi uyobora nk'uko ijambo ry'Imana ribiteganya.
So help me understand, when we look at Jesus in his leadership, what are some characteristics of Jesus' style of leadership?
Ni ibihe bintu tubona biranga ubuyobozi bwe? Kristo tumufasha nk'umuyobozi. Ni ibihe bintu twabona biranga ubuyobozi bwe?
In his earthly ministry, his leadership was marked by humility.
Okay? Leaders are humble.
Ubuyobozi bwa Kristo bwarangwaga n'uko yacaga bugufi.
What else?
Servant. You should talk.
What did you say?
She's whispering.
Oh, yes. What would you like to say? A servant. These things go connected together, but yes, leaders should serve.
Yesu yakoreraga abandi.
Exemplary, as an example.
Yari urugero nyine rw'ibyo yigisha.
Wise. Okay.
Yayoboranaga ubwenge.
Okay, he trained them. He taught them. Sorry, go ahead. What is her name? What's her name? Elise. Yes, Elise. Okay. Yes.
Not like one word. I wanted to say the way of discipline, disciples sharing what they have.
Okay.
Not like a boss or was engaging.
Approachable. Yeah. And he spent time with his disciples, as we're going to see. So let's start at this. So biblical leadership involves service, primarily. Where do we see in Scripture that Jesus served? Where do we see this?
Washing the feet of the disciples.
Okay, washing his disciples' feet. What do you know about washing feet? Was it a good job to have in the Bible time or a bad job? It was a bad job. In fact, in Jewish law, a regular Jew could not wash the feet of another Jew. It was reserved for a slave.
Mu bayuda mu busanzwe wabo ntabwo undi muyuda yari bwoze umuyuda mugenzi w'ibirenge ahubwo umugaragu cyangwa imbata yabo niwo wozaga ibirenge.
It's the lowest of the low.
Mbese ni ikintu cyo hasi nyuma y'ibindi.
Because you remember, this road is somehow familiar to the Bible times. This road here will be very similar. Ladies, any of you who walk with open-toed shoes, you know how your feet look as you walk down this road at the end of the day.
Imihanda yo mu gihe cya kera yari imeze nk'uyu nguyu uri mu ivumbi ryinshi. So rero nk'umuntu ugenda yambaye inkweto zifunguye yawuvuyemo abaza ukuntu bamuzi uko musa.
They're not pleasant.
Ntabwo ibirenge biba bishimishije wanyuze mu muhanda w'imivumbi nk'ahano.
And this road has a nice drainage ditch beside it, so the garbage doesn't sit in the road.
Hano rero hariho nyine hano hantu imyanda ijya ku buryo imyanda itaguma mu ntuza.
But in many places in the world and in the Bible times, the garbage sits on the road, and so people are walking in that as well, the filth and the disgusting stuff.
Mu mihanda rero habaga harimo n'imyanda yose ntaho ijya rero nyine ku buryo kuhanyura mu nyine byabaga harimo.
And so feet have everything on them that you can imagine.
Rero imyanda ibirenge byabaga byagiyeho umwanda wari wose ushoboka.
And so for someone to wash someone's feet was exceptionally degrading.
Rero kuba umuntu yakoza undi birenge byari igikorwa gisuzuguritse cyane.
That person was not considered very respectable.
Uwo muntu ntabwo yabaga ari umuntu wubashywe woza ibirenge abandi.
Because the fact that they were washing feet was indicated their position in society.
Rero nyine kuko uwozaga ibirenge n'abozwaga byagaragazaga aho bahagaze.
So essentially Jesus put himself in the lowest position in society to demonstrate his attitude toward helping other people.
Rero Yesu nyine yemeye kumanuka aca bugufi cyane kugeza aho nyine ahinduka wa muntu woza abandi ibirenge.
Gentlemen, you must be your family's biggest servant.
Rero abagabo bagomba kuba abakozi b'imiryango yabo.
It may not mean that you wash feet.
Okay, ntabwo bisobanuye ko woza ibirenge.
That may not be the practical application.
Ntabwo ari cyo twavanamo.
But what it does mean is that you're up early, headed to work to earn money. It does mean that you're up early to do responsibilities, going to work, taking care of the family. And here's where I'm going to say something, and hear my heart. I don't care what your culture says your responsibility is. The Bible has to speak past your culture and teach you to serve. That's just the reality of the situation. If your culture says that you get to sit aside and the women or children do all of the work, that's not the biblical picture. The biblical picture is that you are a servant. However that looks for your society. And you do a very good job in your culture of honoring positions in leadership. And there's nothing wrong with honoring. But if you demand honor, that's a separate issue. Right? So, I think you understand the principle. I don't need to belabor that. Let's look at some verses. Look at Mark chapter 10, verse 45. 10:45. What do we learn from Jesus' life and service?
Yeah,
go ahead.
aravuga ngo kuko umwana w'umuntu nawe ataze gukorerwa ahubwo yaza gukorera abandi no gutangira ubugingo bwe kuba incungu ya benshi.
What does this verse tell us about Jesus' mentality toward other people?
Niki uyu murongo utwereka ku mitekerereze ya Yesu uburyo atekereza abandi cyangwa uburyo abana n'abandi?
You can read it again if you need.
Umurongo uravuga ngo umwana w'umuntu ntiyaje gukorerwa ahubwo yaje gukorera abandi no gutangira ubugingo bwe kuba incungu ya benshi. Niki turi kubona nyine niki Yesu akorera abandi cyane gute Yesu ameze ku bandi bantu?
His mentality is that he came to serve, not to be served.
Right. Jesus, although he was God, did not come to lord his godhood over everybody.
Nubwo Yesu yari Imana ntabwo yaje ngafata umwana bage abutware bwe nyiraza ari bwo tuyoboza.
So Jesus, yes, he gave his life for the church in salvation, but he gave his life as a means of service as well.
Yatanze ubugingo bwe kugira ngo bube incungu cyangwa se uburyo gakiza kaboneka, ariko yanatanze ubugingo bwe kugira ngo akorere abandi.
Jesus was always ministering to people.
Yesu yahoraga akorera abantu.
And the Bible explains that he would become fatigued and tired because of the way that he was serving.
kandi birigaragaza ko yajyaga aruha akananirwa kubera ukuntu yakoreraga abantu cyane.
Gentlemen, it will not be uncommon for you as a husband and or father to be exhausted.
Rero ni abagabo ni ibintu tuzabona inshuro nyinshi nk'umubyeyi w'abana nk'umupapa kuba urushye cyane.
And there are principles of self-care that need to be addressed, but at the same point, God has called you to spend your life for the sake of your families.
Hari ibintu umuntu agomba kumenya bijyanye no kwiyitaho, ariko Imana iduhamagarira nyine gutanga ubuzima bwacu bw'imiryango yacu nk'abagabo.
Ladies, if the man whom you are pursuing does not demonstrate an ability to work hard, it's probably good evidence that he's not ready to be married.
Abakobwa niba umusore muri kumwe cyangwa mukundana cyangwa atagaragaza ubushake bwo gukora no gukorera urugo rwe, ni ikimenyetso kigaragaza ko umuntu atiteguye gushaka.
Lazy people do not make good husbands.
Ntago abanebwe bajye baba abagabo beza.
They just don't. Lazy people make bad husbands.
Abanebwe bahinduka abagabo babi.
So just keep that in mind.
Right.
I'm not saying they have to have the best job or be at work every day. I'm not saying that. We're talking about principles of character. Right? So we both, gentlemen, be people who the Bible describes in here as someone who's willing to serve and spend the energy. But also women, we look for someone who is that.
Rero Bibiliya nyine umuntu iri kutubwira n'umuntu ufite ubushake bwo gukorera abandi no gukora n'abakobwa rero bakwiye kuba ari umuntu bashaka.
God calls husbands to lead.
Rero Imana ihamagarira abagabo kuba abayobozi.
And leaders serve.
Abayobozi bakorera abandi.
So, but if the husband is to love his wife and serve her as Christ served the church, we have to understand more about Christ's leadership than just service.
Niba rero Bibiliya ihamagarira abagabo gukunda abagore babo kuko Kristo yakunze itorero akaba anarikorera, tugomba kumva ubuyobozi bwa Yesu atari ubuyobozi bukorera abandi gusa ahubwo tukumva ibirenzeho.
Someone from the crowd, not Edson, read Mark chapter 3 verse 14.
Hagira umuntu usomera Mariko 3:14.
Okay, we're going to see a characteristic of Jesus' leadership style.
Mariko 3:14. Hagira umuntu dusomera. Cumi na kane. 3:14.
3:14.
Aravuga atoranyamo 12 bo kubana nawe babone uko ajya batuma kubwiriza abantu ubutumwa.
What does this verse tell us about Jesus and his disciples?
Niki uyu murongo uri kutubwira ku bijyanye na Kristo n'abigishwa be?
Okay, he appointed 12 whom he also named disciples. Remember this morning we talked about the grammar tells us the purpose.
Wibuke ko twavuze yuko amagambo ubwayo ajya tubwira intego y'ibyanditswe. So turabona nyine ko Yesu yaturanyije ngo 12 abita intumwa.
Okay, he appointed 12 whom he also named disciples so that.
Aba rero abatoranyije kugira ngo
What does the grammar tell us is the reason?
Nyine yabise intumwa kugira ngo bigende bite? Abatumwa, to send them.
No. What's the next line? So that he would be with them? Is that your translation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Aha. You skipped something really important.
Icyambere bavuze nuko yabatoye kugira ngo abane nabo.
Right? Don't skip that part. He appointed 12 whom he named disciples so that he might be with them and he might send them out to preach.
Yatoye 12 abita intumwa kugira ngo abane nabo anabatume kubwiriza.
He didn't simply get 12 disciples to go tell them to preach and then you're ready, go.
Ntabwo yigeze afata ba bantu 12 ngo ahita abohereza.
There was a preparation process that had to take place.
Hagombaga kuba uburyo abategura kugira ngo azabatume.
Jesus could not do that preparing if he was not with them.
Ntabwo rero yari bategura atari kumwe nabo.
So the question was asked 2 weeks ago about how can husbands and wives like separate marriages and relationships? Remember this question? You have to translate that. The question was long distance marriages.
Ubushize twabazaga ngo abantu bakundana cyangwa abantu bashakanye bari kure bomwe ari kure y'undi.
You remember that question? Yeah. What would these verses help us to understand about biblical leadership?
Ni iki nyine uyu murongo umurongo utubwira ku buryo nyine uko icyo kibazo twari ku buyobozi bwa Bibiliya, uburyo Bibiliya nyine ivuga ku buyobozi.
If we are to follow Jesus' pattern of leadership, it would be very difficult for us to say that husbands could be effective husbands from another country.
Dukurikije nyine uburyo Yesu arimo abitwereka hano, twavuga ko bigoye kugira ngo umugabo abe umugabo utanga umusaruro aramutse ari mu kindi gihugu gitandukanye n'icy'umugore we.
It's difficult, right? To teach someone everything they need to be the spiritual leader of a family. It's difficult when you're not there.
Biragoye nyine kugira ngo wigishe umuntu umubere umuyobozi mu by'umwuka kandi udahari.
I'm not saying you can't travel for business or something like that, but you should not spend more time away from your family than you do with your family.
Rero ntabwo avuze ko utagenda ku mpamvu zitandukanye, ariko aravuga ko udakwiye kuba ahantu utandukanye n'umuryango wawe kinini kuticubana nabo.
There are more principles that we could address in that, but essentially what we see from Jesus is that in order for Jesus to lead, he was with the people.
Rero hari ibintu byinshi twavuga aho ngaho, ariko icyo tubona hano nuko Yesu kugira ngo ayobore bano bantu nuko yabanye nabo.
Okay, so there's that aspect of his leadership. He gathers 12 so he can be with them, and then point 2, he can send them out.
Rero turabona ko yatoranyije 12 abanza abana nabo noneho nyuma aza kubatuma.
And we see all the time that Jesus sits down to teach his disciples.
Tubona nyine akenshi ko Yesu yicara akigisha abigishwa.
All right, look at Matthew chapter 5 verse 1. What's it say?
Matayo 5:1.
Matthew 5:1.
Abonye abantu benshi azamuka umusozi amaze kwicara abigishwa be baramwegera.
So Jesus, he sits to teach.
Rero turabona nyine ko Yesu yicara akigisha abantu.
He did not lead by just forcing people out when they weren't prepared.
Ntabwo Yesu ubuyobozi bwabukoze bwo kujyana abantu gusa kandi batateguye.
Gentlemen, it is your job to spiritually lead your families.
Abagabo rero ni inshingano yanyu kuyobora imiryango yanyu mu by'umwuka.
You say, well, when does that start?
Ibyo bitangira ryari rero?
Somebody asked a question about evangelistic Bible study. Who is that? Is that you? Sounds like a you question. Right? I do remember the question, right? Like what is the proper way for us to convince women to start hanging out with us? Should we use Bible study as a means to do that? Right?
Abantu nyine bakoresha kwigana ijambo ry'Imana n'ubukobwa nk'inzira yo kumwegera kugira ngo amubwire ko amukunda cyangwa.
What? It was Remy who said that? Nonetheless, we all need it. So a couple of principles regarding this. I think it fits well here. Number 1, we do not do evangelism dating. Okay? Dating is not a form of evangelism. Right?
Gutereta ni ijambo ritari discipline ridafite kurambagiza. Okay. Ntabwo kurambagiza ari uburyo bwo kubwiriza abantu.
Right? Let me see how many people I can go to lunch with this week and see how many girls I can share the gospel with.
Kujya kuvuga nyine yuko wenda ushaka kugenda gusangira nabo kugira ngo urebe abo mwasabwiriza ubutumwa bwiza.
I'm not saying you cannot share the gospel with a man or a male or a female, all right, a person of the opposite gender. What I am saying is that that's not the biblical role of evangelism or of dating.
Rero nyine ntabwo avuze ko tutasangira n'umukobwa cyangwa umuhungu musangire muganire cyangwa umubwire ubutumwa bwiza, ariko ntabwo kurambagiza bikwiye kuvangwa no kubwiriza abantu cyangwa
We do not date someone to share the gospel, and we do not share the gospel so that someone becomes dateable.
ntabwo tubwiriza umuntu, ntabwo turambagiza umuntu kugira ngo tumubwirize, icyo ni kimwe. Nta nubwo tubwiriza umuntu kugira ngo tumurambagize.
Right?
Ibyo byose ntabwo ari byo.
Side principle, we do not date or marry someone for what we hope they will become in the future.
Nta nubwo turambagiza umuntu cyangwa tumushake kubera ko dutekereza ibyo azaba byo wenda mu gihe kizaza.
I'm going to say that again. This is really loud all of a sudden. We do not date or marry someone for what or who we hope they will become in the future.
Ntabwo dushaka umuntu cyangwa tumurambagiza kubera ko dutekereza cyangwa duhanze amaso icyo azaba mu minsi iri imbere.
If we say something like, I think this man is really good looking, and I think if he can learn to love Jesus, he will make a great husband, I'm going to pursue him.
Ntabwo wavuga ngo uyu musore ndabona ari mwiza, uko biri kose nakunda Yesu azaba umugabo mwiza.
Right? Gentlemen, the same thing. She's really pretty. I should share the gospel so I can ask her out. That's not biblical leadership, and it's not biblical service. That's not biblical teaching and training.
Ntabwo rero n'abasore ntabwo wabona umukobwa uvuga ngo ni mwiza, numara kubona ko ari mwiza uvuga ati reka mubwire ubutumwa bwiza kugira ngo nzagire.
So, Jesus' purpose was with his disciples was so that he could prepare them for the purpose for which he had called them.
Intego yo yayisobanura n'abigishwa be ko ari kugira ngo abatume gukora umurimo nyine abahamagara.
So, gentlemen, you need to be the spiritual leaders of your family.
Rero abagabo bakwiye kuba ari bo bayobora cyangwa se yego bayobozi b'iby'umwuka mu miryango yabo.
I would hope that you are leading spiritually prior to having a family, and that can be a demonstration of if you're ready.
Byakabaye byiza cyane kurushaho ubaye uri umuyobozi n'ubundi mu by'umwuka mbere yuko ugira umuryango, byaba ari ikimenyetso cyiza cy'uko uzabikora.
But just because you lead others spiritually doesn't really mean that you're leading yourself spiritually.
Ariko nanone kuyobora abandi mu by'umwuka ntabwo bivuze ko wowe ubwawe uyobora mu by'umwuka.
Completely transparently, it would be absolutely possible for me to come up here and preach this morning out of 1 Peter chapter 1 and be watching inappropriate movies the night before. It's possible.
Birashoboka cyane ko yaza akatwigisha Petero wa mbere ariko akaba yarareba ibintu bidakwiye mu ijoro ryakeye. Birashoboka cyane.
Right? It's possible for me to scream and yell at my wife and my children all morning long and come up and put on a good face and a good show and preach. It's possible.
Ko yaba yaratongana n'umuryango we n'umugore we n'abana be mu gitondo akaza akatwigisha.
So just because you're leading others spiritually doesn't mean you're leading yourself.
Ntabwo rero kuba uri umuyobozi w'abandi bivuze yuko wowe ubwawe uri umuyobozi mwiza w'umwuka kuri wowe.
This goes back to last week's discussion about spiritual submission.
Rero bidahita bisubira nyine inyuma ku byo twize twabanje yuko umuntu akwiye kuganduka.
So Jesus serves his disciples and he leads his disciples and spends time with them to teach them.
Rero Yesu amarana igihe n'abigishwa be ari kubigisha nyine.
But we also see that Jesus let his disciples make decisions and he gives them a certain level of autonomy at times.
Rero Yesu amarana igihe n'abigishwa be abigisha ariko kanabaha n'ubutware rimwe na rimwe.
We see multiple times where he sends them out with specific directions.
Hari igihe yaboherezaga babwiye neza n'icyo bagomba gukora.
Just if you look at Mark chapter 1,
bari ku gice cya mbere
verses 35 through 39.
Umurongo wa 39 kugeza 35
And so he talks, and let's just look at 38, Mark 1:38. Verse 38 says, and Jesus said to his disciples, let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there. And he went through all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. But verse 36 says that Simon has come to him, and they have this discussion, and they're searching for him because they've been out ministering as well. When we look at John chapter 4, we see that Jesus' disciples were the ones who did all of the baptizing. And so Jesus was preparing these people for when he would no longer be there.
rero Yesu yarimo abategurira nyine mu gihe we azaba atakiri kumwe nabo.
So Jesus would regularly delegate his authority to other people.
Rero yajyaga afata ubuyobozi yahawe akabuha n'abigishwa be.
But whenever he did so, he was giving specific instructions on how they were to act.
Ariko iyo yajyaga baha ubutware yajyaga babwira neza akabasobanurira ibyo bagomba gukora ibyo ari byo.
And so Jesus was giving the disciples the ability to understand what he wanted them to do, but the freedom to know when to shake the dust off their feet, so to speak.
Rero Yesu nyine yabahaga ubutware bwo gukora ibyo bagomba gukora, akanabasobanurira n'ibyo bagomba gukora ibyo ari byo, akanababwira.
Does that make sense? Right? So Jesus tells them to go into the towns, but he says if they don't receive you, shake the dust off of your feet, basically say, fine, we're going to move on from this place.
Rero yajyaga abohereza mu midugudu akababwira ngo mugende nibabakira mubabwirize, nibatabakira mukunga umurimo mukuru wo ku birenge byanyu.
Jesus didn't go with them to all of those towns and villages.
Kandi ntabwo Yesu yajyanaga nabo muri iyo midugudu yose.
He gave them instructions, but he gives them freedom within those instructions.
Yababwiraga nyine yuko ibyo bagomba gukora, ariko akabarekera nyine gukora ibyo bagomba gukora bandi.
In the same way, being a spiritual leader does not mean that you're a micromanager of everything your family has to do.
Kuba umuyobozi w'iby'umwuka mu rugo rwawe ntabwo bivuze ko ari wowe ugenga buri kantu kose gakorwa iwawe.
And so we have to understand what it means to lead spiritually.
Tugomba kumva nyine kuyobora.
It's to guide and direct.
Ni ugutanga icyerekezo.
It's to teach.
Ni ukwigisha.
And it's to serve.
Ni gukorera abandi.
So that when people are so that specifically, gentlemen, when your wife is in a position, she knows how she is to act and how she is to behave.
Ku buryo mu gihe umugore wawe akeneye kugira icyo akora, agomba kumenya uko akwiye kwitwara.
This is your responsibility as the leader of the home.
Rero ni inshingano yawe nk'umuyobozi w'urugo rwawe.
Is that you would help your wife to understand the Word of God,
kumufasha kumva ijambo ry'Imana,
to understand what she is supposed to do,
kugira ngo yumve amenye icyo agomba gukora.
but at the same time you give her freedom in that.
Ako nanone ukamuha uburenganzira bwo gukora icyo agomba gukora.
Just by way of example, this could be mostly, a lot of this would come in very easily with children.
Urugero ariko byakumvikana cyane ku bana.
Right, there are times, for by example, that I have to travel outside the country for my work.
Hari igihe rimwe na rimwe bibaho ko agenda akava mu gihugu nyine,
or at least be gone outside the city for a few days.
cyangwa se akaba atari i Kigali.
Right? But my wife and I know that we have principles in which we are going to raise our children.
Ariko we n'umufasha we bazi uburyo nyine bagomba kurera abana babo.
And so we have looked at scripture, come up with those principles together.
Bareba byanditswe, bareba amahame nyine akwiye ku.
And I delegate the authority to her in that situation.
Iyo yagiye rero agasigira ubushobozi cyangwa ubuyobozi
And
umugore
she
we.
has the freedom to handle the children however she wants within how we have designated our family to
Rero
do things.
umufasha w'icyo gihe aba afite ubushobozi bwo kwita ku bana be no kubamenya, ariko ari muri izo principe, muri ayo mahame bashyize.
Right? And so, gentlemen, it will be your responsibility to make sure that your spouse understands God's design, God's rules. That's your responsibility to make sure that she understands.
So rero ni inshingano yacu kumenya nyine ko abagore bumva neza, basobanukiwe nyine ibyo ngibyo bagomba gukora kugira ngo babashe kubikora mu gihe bibaye ngombwa.
Because ultimately the responsibility falls to you.
Kubera ko inshingano nyine birangira zibaye izawe.
Remember in James chapter 3, James says, "Let not very many of you become teachers, because you will be held to a stricter judgment."
Muribuka ko Yakobo avuga ngo ntiyakagira muri twe benshi bifuza kuba bigisha kubera ko bazahanwa kurenza abandi.
We see that spiritual leaders have to give account for the way that they lead spiritually.
Kandi abayobozi mu by'umwuka bagomba kubazabazwa uburyo bayoboye abandi.
So gentlemen, lest you think that you can just abdicate your responsibility to your wives, you will be held responsible for how you lead your family.
Rero abagabo mu gihe cyose ari twe nyine abayobozi tuzabazwa uburyo tuyobora imiryango yacu.
As a corollary, something that is connected but like the opposite side. Okay? Let me just explain. On the other side, ladies, you need to follow the spiritual leadership of your husband because he is responsible for you.
Rero abagore nyine bagomba kuyoboka cyangwa se kumvira ubuyobozi bw'abagabo babo, kubera ko abagabo bazabazwa uburyo bayobora abagore.
Obviously, if he is leading you in an unspiritual direction like we talked about last week, that's a different discussion.
Ariko niba kuyobora mu byaha nyine biratandukanye ibyo ngibyo.
But as much as the man in your life is leading you spiritually, you need to submit to that direction and that authority in your
ariko mu
life.
gihe cyose nyine umugabo wawe cyangwa se akuyoboranye mu buryo bukwiye bw'umwuka nyine ukwiye kumwumvira.
I mentioned last week about the situation with my family, my wife and I, where I wanted to leave and she didn't want to leave. If we had left, that decision would have been on me. Right? God would have held me responsible for that, not my wife. He would have held me responsible for that decision. Why? If I make the wrong decision for my family, why does God hold me responsible and not my wife? Because I'm the what? I'm the leader. I'm the leader. Right? In the military in the US, if someone under your command does something stupid, it is very often that you also get fired.
iyo umuntu uri munsi y'ubutware bwakoze amakosa hari amahirwe menshi ko uwo muyoboye nawe wirukana.
Because that leader is responsible for the behavior of the people under
kubera ko wowe uri hejuru ubanza kubya abantu bose bari munsi yawe.
And so we have to understand the serious nature of what it means to lead.
Tugomba rero kumva uburyo kuyobora ari ikintu gikomeye.
But we have an example.
ariko dufite urugero nanone.
Jesus provides us with the perfect example of what it means to lead.
kuko Yesu aduha urugero rwiza rw'icyo tukuyobora nyine aricyo.
And so in order for us to lead, gentlemen, we must imitate Jesus Christ.
Rero kugira ngo tubashe kuyobora nk'abagabo tugomba kwigana Kristo.
Someone read for me 1 Corinthians 11 verse 1.
Abakorinto ba mbere 11 umurongo wa mbere. Hagira udusomera. umurongo wa mbere.
What does Paul say here?
What's
Paul say in 1 Corinthians 11:1? Imitate me. And is that really what he says? Is that all? What's the rest? Imitate me as I imitate Christ. Paul isn't saying, I'm a super spiritual person. Look at me, look what I do. Paul says, I'm trying to be like Jesus. And if you try to be like me, that means you will also be being like Jesus. Right? Because if we're all in the line and you're following me and I'm following Edson, whom are we really following? If you're in the back of the line, you're not following the person right in front of you, you're following the person at the very front. So Paul tells the Corinthians to do what he does because he is doing what Jesus does. This goes for all of us, but gentlemen, mostly. You need to be someone that other people can be like. Because you're being like Jesus. Your wife should want to be like you because you're being like Jesus. Ladies, find someone whom you can imitate who is imitating Jesus. So husbands, gentlemen, you have to lead. But you also have to love. And this is where it gets much harder. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to break into some small groups. Okay? Alright, so grab, let's see. I have a few passages. First passage, Titus 2, verses 3 through 5. Let's see how many I have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,